chip in here, it's encouraging to hear what's happening here and there around the world. Just going to mention two things real briefly. Ireland, our Irish colleague, Emir Osukra, very strong with alternative economics, new economics, and our policy. She said, there's an article released by the federal government of Ireland recommending land value tax. And she had really pretty much given up on seeing the possibilities there, and then this came out, so it's a ray of sunshine. Now, the other is South Africa. How many have been hearing about what's been happening in South Africa?
Yeah, it sounds terrible, but what is it?
Well, they have a crisis now of the land problem. It's boiling over. A new party has been created called the Economic Freedom Fighters. They're very vocal, very strong. They want land confiscation without compensation. The early history of Africa, we're talking hundreds of years ago, when the people who were being persecuted in Northern Europe and so on came to South Africa for their own freedoms. And it was very, very sparsely settled then. And it had kind of like indigenous people. So many of the Africans, black Africans from now South Africa, really were moving down from the north as these other farmers from Northern Europe were growing and improving and so on, and it was making improvements, and so it was becoming an attractive place to live, and people were immigrating to South Africa. But the minority white South Africans, of course, owned vast amounts, a disproportionate amount of land. I think it's something like 14% of the people have 85% of the land. So as we know, there was once land value tax in some of the cities, but post-apartheid, everything got thrown out, the baby with the bathwater, starting from scratch. And actually World Bank and IMF policies came in, and so they got neoliberal economics, they got a billionaire class, and this class division among black Africans has been ripping the country apart because the majority of Africans haven't seen any progress post-apartheid. They're still living in terrible poverty. So the economic freedom fighters latching on to the communist socialist agenda, you know, the first point of the Communist Manifesto is nationalize land and collect the full ground rent. Well, they went, we know you can collect ground rent without land nationalization, but they're actually now going in and taking the land from the white South African farmers, but violently, and there's been a number of murders, and people are living in great fear, and numbers of those people are now migrating. I heard that Russia has offered refuge. So Russia's giving away free land to its citizenry because they have so much, so people can have small farms. That's an aside. But what we have done as the IU is compose a very articulate, we're pretty happy with the letter, and submitted it to the committee of the African national government that was really asking for input on what to deal with the land problem. And so we found out there were how many, David? Like 70,000 submissions. So it's a place to really pay attention to. We have Stephen Menches, and we have Peter Meakin, long time, very strong Georgist there. They've been trying to get the federal government to pay attention to their own constitution that would certainly align with land value taxes. They're trying to get them to obey the constitution with land value tax, but it's just such a hot spot. That's all I want to say. So I think my time's up.
You had a minute to spare. How about that?
Oh, you know, I thought I was getting pressure to stop. In that case, I want to say,
Okay,
I want to mention
don't
one
make it-
name. I want to mention our new vice president for the IU, Mabangwa Masifala. And he's been an advisor and in government at very high levels of South Africa, and he's very strong in understanding land value tax. Hey, it would be great if we could have him join us one day. What? Huh?
And is it concerned for water?
And he's in the water field advisor.
I got two. Well, Ed and Ralph. You've got 10 minutes left. So, okay. Is that all right with you? I mean, you got to bring something you want to say? Because I'll let you do it if you do. Yeah. You do have something burning you want to say? All right, go ahead. So I'll make it short. Yeah, please.
I just want to thank you, Alana. I appreciate your enthusiasm and excitement. It's always a pleasure to hear you speak. So thank you for that energy. I'm reminded of saying from Nelson Mandela. He talked about that what people are most afraid of is not their weakness and not their powerlessness. What they're really afraid of is how powerful we really are if we would accept some of what, some of what we have within us. But I wanted to speak, and I'll try to make it brief for Mike because I understand there's two other speakers. I wanted to talk about how to improve our organization or our efforts. And I think one of our weaknesses is that we don't have clear enough objectives, and that the objective isn't obvious when we say we're here at a Georgist conference. I wanted to share with you that I think I found a major flaw in Henry George's thinking, or at least in his vocabulary.
Sir, there's your serious charges.
I know. Should I start now?
And we're going to spend 2 minutes on that?
Well, no, let me just say it really quickly, and we can discuss it later. But I think that the flaw is that he used the word confiscate, and that it gets repeated, like in that article in the Economist, it was repeated twice. And I think when people see, you're going to confiscate economic rent or land values, people get alarmed or they just dismiss it. And so that's my concern, one of my concerns. The other concern that I have is that I don't know of any successful phenomenon in the world, or any terrific victories that have come about because of an organization that takes on a person's name and then puts its ist or ism at the end of the person's name.
Like Christianity?
That's not an ist. It's not Christianist.
So we should call ourselves Georgianity?
Thank you. There you got it.
All right.
Good idea.
Thank you, Alan.
Thank you.
Come on, Ed. Chop, chop.
Oh, I've pondered for a long time why the educational effort of the Henry George movement has faltered, and my answer has always been, well, after the Second World War, at least in the United States, we created junior colleges, trade schools, etc., and gave people an opportunity to get credentials. We are a very credential-oriented society world. Without credentials, you go nowhere. So, we've had efforts. There have been efforts along the way to say we got to have a university. We got to create a university. Thanks to our colleague Lindy Davies, we have college-eligible courses, and maybe the Henry George School in New York will eventually get there as well. But there's a model that was offered a number of years ago that has always struck me as pretty funny. And when I teach, I often show a video of this model, and it was presented by a comedian named Dan Navarro. Dan Navarro was on Saturday Night Live for many years, and he played this Catholic priest named Guido Sarducci. And in one of his stand-up routines, he said, "I'm going to start the 20-minute university." and you come, you pay your fee was $10 or $20. You take the courses, and at the end of 20 minutes, you graduate, you get your certificate, your degree, it's a diploma, we take your picture, we have a celebration, we give you a cap and gown for the rental fee, and you're a college graduate. And what do you learn in your 20 minutes? Well, you learn in that 20 minutes what a college graduate will remember 5 years after getting their degree. So in economics, he said, what do you learn about economics in college? Supply and demand. So that's the question on your test. What did you learn? What is supply and demand? And that's the answer. And there were some other things he went through that were really humorous. He said, after we finish getting your degree, I'm thinking of starting a 10-minute law school. So anyway, in the 20-minute Henry George University would have a test at the end. And what would you recommend would be the answer to the question, what did you learn in the Henry George University after your 20 minutes?
Land
rent.
There you go. And so you get your degree and you go out there with your credentials to start changing the world.
I don't see Sadie in the audience. There she is. But Sadie will verify this. That when I taught my class,
Use the mic.
for many years in art, when I taught classes, everybody said, now if you don't know the answer to the question, just say land. Chances are you'll be right. All right, Ralph, you're the last one. You have the final say. You've still got 4 minutes.
Good morning, everyone. I just want to say that Mike asked me a question yesterday, Mr. Curtis, and he said, who's your greatest teacher? And I really left out the man that it is. It's Henry George, that's been one of the great teachers, and it's really how inspiring he was, because he was dedicated and devoted, not for himself, but for the people.
I got posted. Quick post.
I'm going to take a vote. I'm going to take a vote. Want Bob to speak for 1 minute? After Sue?
I did.
If there's any time left, Bob.
It will be very quick. You are all invited to the CGO business meeting. People think, oh, I'm not a member, I'm not repping an organization. Everyone who attends a CGO conference is invited to attend the business meeting, which follows this immediately. And there's an important discussion as the main part of business. We're going to talk about the future of the CGO, where we want to be. So I encourage you, if you say, I don't want to hear about a treasurer's report, go out, have a cup of coffee, come back, and we'll be ready by that time. And so definitely come.
Back in the years, not try to create one of our own. But, I'm sure as a tag to gather together the discontent we see out there. I'm looking at stuff from 100 years ago, 120 years ago, 40 years ago, and that's the best word I've come up with, and I don't like it. So please be thinking of something that would help us. Well, discontent, the bitterness, unrest.
Malaise?
Well, but there's an anger in it, there's a frustration, there's a knowing it's just not right.
Tax?
How about social anxiety? Bring it back.
Say again?
Social anxiety.
So does the tax on land values lower the selling price of land?
Should.
Huh?
It should.
It should. That's a moral judgment.
Well, it's a considered opinion.
It's a mathematical judgment.
A mathematical judgment?
I passed out a 3-page leaflet that should all gotten about rent taxing the rent.
Yeah. So,
It's behavior.
Ilana?
It depends. Some
Ah,
places
that's-
it goes higher and some places it goes lower.
Yeah. So how come every place that we know of, Anderson's got 100 different examples where they implemented some degree of a higher tax on land values. How come in every case we know of, the selling price of land in those areas went up?
Because they're urban.
It's good people
Oh,
moved in.
laws of physics don't work in urban areas?
Well, they may be overall, but urban area has a wide variety of land in terms of prices going up and down.
Well, could it be that,
No,
It's the degree
I
of
started to,
taxation.
we got,
If you tax
I got
99% of rent,
well, could it be that in every instance where we know of, like Pittsburgh and Harrisburg and Denmark, that they lowered other taxes?
okay.
And of course, the value of land has to do with all the advantages minus the disadvantages. And we started adding advantages. We took the taxes off of other things before we put the tax on land. And what did it do? Stimulated the redevelopment. And it made those cities and places where the land tax was a more desirable place to be. And the rent of land is determined by the margin of production. And in Henry George's rendition of it, it's the best land that can be had for free. We didn't create any free land because in America, 300 million people can migrate to any place that starts to lower rents because it encourages the use of land.
Well,
So of course it made those cities much more desirable places, and that's why the rent went up. Not because the tax on land doesn't, all other things being equal, diminish the selling price. Fair enough, my 5 minutes is anywhere near up.
You got a minute?
I got a minute. Am I right?
You're absolutely right, Mike.
Thank you, sir. I quite agree for what it's worth. Now let's hear from Sadie Somerville.
Okay. Good morning. I'm Sadie Somerville, and I'm from the single tax village of Arden in Delaware, which is just 90 miles north of here. And I'm the director of the Arden Georgist and have been for the past 25 years. But I also am involved in the history of the Georgist history of Arden and the Arden Craft Shop Museum. I've enjoyed the number of historic figures that have been spoken about at this conference, such as Jackson Ralston, Eleanor Ostrom, and Jose Marti, which inspired me to tell you about the Georgists that have been part of Arden's history. It all started with this Delaware single tax campaign, 1895-96-ish, which was an attempt to win control of a small political entity called Delaware and put Georgist principles into action in order to demonstrate how well it would work for the rest of the USA. And the rest would follow, right? Well, unfortunately, their single tax campaign was not successful, but a number of activists were jailed, and they proudly called themselves the Dover Jail Single Tax Club. But there were a few dedicated Georgists who would not give up their dream to create a Georgist community. In 1900, Philadelphians Will Price and Frank Stevens, with financial assistance from Joseph Bells, founded Arden in northern Delaware. It was named for the idyllic forest in Shakespeare's As You Like It as an experimental single-tax village community. Frank Stevens, known as Patro in the village, which is Esperanto for father, strongly held his Georgist ideals and worked on creating other single-tax communities up until he died in Gilpin Point, Maryland in 1935. His son, Don Stevens, who participated as a boy in the Delaware campaign, carried on with social activism, including Russian farm reconstruction in the early 1920s, and founded another single-tax village of Arden Town in 1922, still based on the Georgist principles. He died in the early 70s. There were other Arden families who, for generations, worked on promoting Henry George, such as the Rosses and the Curtises. Then there was a young man who grew up in Arden and became passionate about Henry George in 1974, and has continued teaching and advocating for land tax until now, and his name is Mike Curtis, who we just heard from. Mike has been a mover and shaker in the Ardens over the years and served the community in various capacities, including as trustee of Arden for the past 14 years. I would like to recognize and thank him for all of his Georgist contributions to the Ardens. I know that someday in the future, others, like us, will look back and see what he has done for the community in continuing Arden's history of Georgism. Thank you.
Oh, thank you. Thanks very much, Sadie. Now, I would like to bring to the stage the inimitable Herb Berry.
All right.
You didn't want to come up? No? I thought you were waiting to come up. Okay. If you don't want to, that's fine. No pressure.
It's probably unlikely that he doesn't want to.
Okay. I thought you were waiting to come up.
Well, I was.
Well, there you
Oh.
go.
Understand that you were targeting me. Well, I'd like to have some audience participation. Think back to 2 years ago, the presidential election, and if you voted for Donald Trump for president, would you raise one arm?
I'm going to cut it off, huh?
But if you voted for Hillary Clinton, would you raise one arm? If you voted for either the Green Party candidate, yeah, and he voted for Libertarian Party candidate, Yeah. Well, since Hillary Clinton, she won more votes than Donald Trump, but she won less than 50% of the vote. So the procedure, which is done in the solid South, Democratic South for many decades, was to have a runoff election. And if there had been a runoff election, certainly Hillary Clinton would have won, because both of these libertarian and especially Green Party candidates would have preferred her to Donald Trump. Well, one of the first things that Donald Trump did when he became president was to file the paperwork for him to run for re-election in 2020. So he's well prepared for this. But I want to point out some considerable hope that he will be defeated. Yesterday I talked about how there was how there was during recessions, during fiscal collapse, people vote against the incumbent, and I want to read a brief letter that the Pittsburgh newspaper published on August 6th. And so this is my letter. President Donald Trump was glorified in the column, "The Economy is Booming," by Cal Thomas. This theme is premature. An unusual fiscal boom is often followed soon by a major financial bust. The Wikipedia article, List of Recessions in the United States, I quoted from it yesterday, identified 49 financial contractions from 1785 through 2017. The average interval between successive contractions is between 4 and 5 years, more precisely 4.5 years. Mr. Trump has been president for less than 2 years. I believe that his policies, including massive government deficits, will result soon in a major financial contraction. The 8-year presidencies of Democrats Bill Clinton and Barack Obama, I think Trump himself has criticized him for not having a stronger economic recovery. They contained no financial contraction, either of the two Democratic presidents. The 8-year presidencies of Republicans Ronald Reagan and George W. Bush both contained a financial contraction early in their first terms. The second term of Mr. Bush ended with the Great Recession of 2007 to 2009.
Thanks very much, Herb. Now, ladies and gentlemen, please give it up for the one and only Carl Shaw.
Thank you very much for allowing me to speak. I've been here about 3 days. I don't think I've heard the word rent. The word rent is one of the most important words in our language. It's annual payment for the use of land to a landowner. Should I get closer? Thank you. Any land which is worth anything is worth so much money per year. You probably all feel that. I understand that. The rental amount varies according to population and our business activity cycle. Competition in the business world helps increase rent. So the more population, the more rent. Rent is a community product. It's attributable to the whole society. When land gets taxed, it's the rent which gets publicly collected. How can you ignore the word rent? When some rent is not taxed, the remainder gets capitalized into sale price. There's a formula. Income, which is rent, divided by the interest rate equals value. You're all followers of older Georgists. You've been with this for many years. You've listened to your seniors for them to say land value taxation, and so you've learned to say land value taxation. So you continue saying this description of Henry George's economic philosophy. So along the line, the word rent has been forgotten. How can we forget the word which is publicly created by society, gets tax collected to finance local government, it determines the sale value of land. Rent plays a great role in our life and our language. Sure. Land value never gets tax collected. Value cannot be taxed. Value is the result of a mathematical formula. I guess that the uneducated public gets turned off by hearing about land value being tax collected. The public is used to a society which is used to buying and selling land, earning a profit without doing any work. If we talked about rent being a social product, which in morals belongs to all society, and which when fully taxed would benefit an economy, our economy and society, people might listen to our social and economic reform idea. Rent is the primary word in economics. When I studied real estate appraisal years ago and became appraisal, I gave up calling for land value taxation. You should too. Are there questions about land value taxation versus rent? No questions. Thank you.
Joe?
Yeah. I'm glad you didn't say the one and only Joe Johnston, because there's another Joe Johnston very well known in the South. He was General Joe Johnston, who was the one Confederate general who surrendered to Sherman in Durham, North Carolina, which is 10 miles away from where I live. But that's not what I came to talk about. There's an interesting movement going on called Better Angels. I don't know if any of you have heard about it, but it's a movement to try to get people on the left and on the right to talk civilly to one another. And I just really suggest that we look into that. And while we are often inclined to denigrate people who are on the opposition, it's very important to listen to them, especially the ordinary people. And of course, one of the things that the Trump people originally put forward was there's been no improvement in wages and the cost of increase. Obviously, we have a solution to that. But we do have to listen to those people who are, those who are up on the right, if you will, which probably not few of us are, but it's important to listen to and to respect them. I mentioned yesterday about asking the right question. One of the questions, another one I propose is, when discussing Georgism, is how long does it take for a person of ordinary education, ordinary skill, to buy the 1 hour of another person of similar value? Well, if there is a sales tax or wage tax in place, they're going to have to work longer than 1 hour to do that. If there is no tax on the work, either in, say, a sales tax or wage tax, they'll work 1 hour and they'll get it. And of course, you can apply the same thing. How long would it take? And while we just realized that that the price of land does not always go down with land wage tax, but certainly the other values do go up. You can ask, how long does it take the person of average means to work? How long do they have to work to buy one living space, 350 square feet or so which is the same as one parking space, by the way, 350 square feet. Anyway, the important thing is to, again, respect and listen with respect and speak with respect to people who are have opposing views. Thank you.